Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today is going to be a very wonderful day for me because I get to be a little bit lazy. I'm going to turn the hosting over to my friend Neil Arya, who is a physician in the Waterloo area and is the director of a wonderful organization called Pegasus. And Pegasus consists of a lot of folks worldwide. He seems to have a network that is maybe comparable to mine in size, and which is a lot of folks. And these are largely people who are who are in health professions, and who are also interested in peace and geopolitical matters. And today he has two guests. So I'm going to ask him to introduce his guests, and I am going to be less the host than usual. Good morning, Neil.
Morning, Meta. And thank you for that introduction. As we've mentioned before, this is part of people introducing people who are going to be part of our Pegasus conference at the beginning of May. And it is a great pleasure to meet in this forum with Michael and Val. I got to know Michael almost 20 years ago as we were, actually more than 20 years ago. I guess it was around the time of the war in Iraq, and we were interviewed by CTV London, I believe, at that time, and then we continued to talk about common interests in the Middle East in particular, and Palestine more specifically. And with Val, got to know her as we became part of the Lancet Commission on Peace, Gender, and Health, SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals 3, 5, and 16. And Val was the lead author to that. And so I should say that both have become friends, Val Percival and Michael Lynk. Almost 2 years ago, we started to talk more about the right to health. Michael and I had talked about the right to health as he was the human rights rapporteur for the occupied territories, and seeing me as a health person. And then with Val on this Lancet Commission, we were also interested in health and security. And so the idea of developing an article came up very specifically with Gaza, where we saw major violations in terms of the right to health.
I'm an associate professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, but I started out as a young person, extremely interested in understanding conflict and conflict dynamics. And that I have an undergraduate degree in peace and conflict studies from the University of Toronto, and then went on to do a master's in conflict studies and a doctorate in public health, focusing on health and conflict. I have kind of a bit of a unique background, I guess, for an academic. I have worked in the field. So I worked on the border of Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. I've also worked in the Balkans as well as in Mozambique, and also worked for the Government of Canada, for the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. So I have a little bit of field experience and a little bit of policy experience. And now I'm in the research space and focusing on the relationship between conflict and health. And at this particular moment, like all of us are, I'm really troubled by what's happening globally, and also really troubled by the lack of response, I guess, to the erosion of international norms, including the right to health, and the collapse of global solidarity in many ways.
My background is as a lawyer. I practiced labor law for probably a decade in Toronto and Ottawa before becoming an academic. I joined the Faculty of Law at Western University in 1999, and I taught there until the end of 2022, 3 years ago. During that time, I developed both a strong interest in workplace rights and labor law in Canada, but also questions with respect to Palestine as well. I first went to Palestine and Israel in 1981. I skipped my law school graduation to do so, and then I went a number of times since, including working for 6 months for the United Nations at the end of the 1980s in Jerusalem during the first Palestinian uprising or Intifada. Along the way, I would write not only on issues of human rights and labor law in Canada, but I also would write law review articles on Palestine as well and the application of international law. And all of that led to the chance to become the 7th UN Special Rapporteur on human rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territory. I was elected unanimously by the UN Human Rights Council in March of 2016, and I served for 6 years in that position until May of 2022. During that course of time, I wrote 2 reports a year, 12 in total, on various aspects related to Israel's occupation in Palestine. One of my early reports was on the right to health. And I explored both what the right to health means in international law and how it's being misapplied by Israel with respect to its occupation of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. And since I finished my UN posting and my time as a law professor at Western, I've been quite active in wanting to write and speak about Palestine and Gaza, particularly during the past 2 years since October 2023. So all of that means I retain, I guess, a vivid interest today in how international law applies, what it means for the humanitarian situation of the Palestinians, and trying to think creatively and looking forward to how do we wind up resolving this in a way that's consistent with international law and consistent with the aspirations and human rights of Palestinians and Israelis.
Yeah, quite a big pie to swallow, I guess. Probably mixing some metaphors there. And so, yes, I'd like to get into that in particular in terms of finding hope out of something that for years has seemed less hopeful. But I think, as Val talked about, I think even in the last few months, there have been various challenges to rules-based international order. Val, could you just talk about how you see those and what is different now, or what is now recognized or perceived as being different now, and where you see things headed? And later we'll talk about how to have things head in a more positive direction.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. That's a big question. So I'll just try and highlight a few points. I think, the erosion of kind of the rules-based order isn't something that's just started recently. Those rules have always been contested and under strain. But I think what we're seeing now is, the United States has become kind of the wrecking ball of those rules and of that kind of international order. And we're seeing an increasingly militarized foreign policy. We see that in our own foreign policy. I think $2.7 trillion in military spending in 2024. And we know with an increase in the militarization of foreign policy, that brings a certain type of person to the decision-making table. And it excludes the kind of people that are, I guess, part of this conversation today. I think we're also seeing kind of the polarization of human rights and of humanitarian issues, things that used to be seen as neutral and not contested, have all of a sudden become objects of contestation. The right to health, and Michael will go into this probably in more detail, but the right to health is something that should be embraced as being important for individuals, important for communities, and important for stability in terms of the broader kind of context it's strategically important as well as a right. And yet we're seeing that be eroded. And so I think that, and then one final point, I think that we're also seeing, while the United States is kind of the wrecking ball of the international order, we're not seeing other countries step up in the way that I had hoped. And I think that Canada is very guilty of this. We're so afraid of impacting on trade negotiations. And those are real concerns, and I don't want to minimize that. But we have not used our position in a way to push for peace, and to push for kind of a return to human security and human rights and things like the right to health. And when we do, it's very rhetorical and performative. It's not backed up with substance.
I think when you mentioned the $2.7 trillion, now 20 years ago, when I studied this much more, we were at less than a trillion, and the U.S. had 47%, I think, of the fund of the spending at that time. But just seeing the acceleration, and beyond that, looking at NATO spending now projected to increase much more.
Let's remember that the starting point for our modern international order began in 1945 with the end of the Second World War, the creation of the United Nations with the explicit purpose of creating an international political architecture that was going to prevent a third world war and also try to manage and discourage smaller conflicts and wars around the world from breaking out. The cornerstone of this was the United Nations Charter that was signed and agreed to in October 1945. Among other things, the UN Charter said that states are to respect the sovereignty of other states, that there only were very limited justifiable reasons for going to war, either if you had a green light coming from the UN Security Council, or if you were acting purely in self-defense, and if you were in trying to repel an actual attack or an imminent threat, that you were using your forces proportionate to what the situation wound up demanding. And while there have been many, many wars and millions of casualties over the last 80 years caused by conflict, I suspect that the toll of civilian suffering and death would have been much, much greater had it not been for this cornerstone of international law and the international political architecture that we have created in the United Nations. One large exception to this has to be the question of Israel and Palestine. The issue of Palestine has been the longest running item on the UN agenda. It's almost as old as the UN itself. The UN was created in 1945. Its very first major political issue on its agenda was the question of what is the future of Mandate Palestine. And once the United Kingdom announced in 1947 that it was going to give up the League of Nations mandate that had been given to it, and it was asking the UN to chart a path forward. And what the UN did in one of its first big ventures into the international stage, and arguably one of its first major mistakes, was to recommend the partition of Palestine into both a Jewish state and an Arab state, against the fervent wishes of the indigenous majority population in Palestine, the Palestinians, who made up 2/3 of the population at the time of the 1947 resolution and at the United Nations to recommend partition. The subsequent consequences of that decision was a war in 1948, the creation of the State of Israel, and the expulsion of around 750,000 Palestinians who became refugees, and Israel refused to grant them the right to return, which had been mandated in a UN resolution in December of 1948. And we've lived with the consequences of this ever since. If you read the memoir, the very eloquent memoir of Kofi Annan, who served as UN Secretary General between 1996 and 2005, I believe it was, he writes that the issue of Palestine, the unresolved issue of Palestine, haunts UN halls, wherever the UN winds up operating. And it's been on the top or near the top of the UN agenda over the past almost 80 years now, still unresolved, still causing huge divides among countries and among regions. And it's probably further from resolution than ever before. The fact that Israel has been able to maintain a 58-year-old occupation, which has been declared 18 months ago by the International Court of Justice to be an illegal occupation, the fact that Israel has defied countless UN Security Council resolutions on the fact that its settlements are illegal, a flagrant violation of international law, that it refuses to apply the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, which applies to the laws of occupation, the fact that it has illegally annexed East Jerusalem and continues to de facto illegally annex the West Bank, and has conducted what appears now to be, but from a number of organizations, a genocide in Gaza over the last 2 years, has been probably one of the very sharpest wounds that our regime of international law has suffered in the course of the last 80 years. And that all goes back really to 1947, and the fact that the refugees have been unable to return to their homes in Palestine, the fact that after 1967, Israel started an occupation with the explicit aim of conquering East Jerusalem and the West Bank and not returning it to its people, the Palestinians. So if we consider, and this is my last point, if we consider that international law is actually the reflection of the norms and values of the modern world, that it tries to enhance the protection of human rights, it tries to enhance the protection of state sovereignty, it tries to advance the issues of the right to development, the right to health, the right to live in a world peaceably and secure from wars and from the threat of particularly of nuclear wars, then the demise of international law, its wounding, the ways in which countries are evading the strictures and the sturdy guardrails of international law can only lead us in a worse path towards a future that is not at all bright, that is increasingly dark. And as we've heard in commentary coming from the White House over the last week, that it's the restoration of might makes right, and the fact that international law counts for nothing. All of this should give all of us alarm as to where we're heading with respect to this. If we let go of the promise and the strictures of international law, then we're entering into a law of the jungle that none of this will turn out well for any of us.
Well, maybe you could talk a bit about the Lancet Commission.
Sure. The Lancet Commission was, as you know, Anil, it was an effort to really establish an empirical foundation for what the links are between increased health outcomes and increased gender equality, so increased health equity, increased gender equality, and more peaceful societies. And we approach this by undertaking cross-national statistical analysis to try and establish this empirical evidence base. And what we found was that there was very clear evidence that improvements in health in particular, but also in gender equality, did contribute to what we called nudging societies out of vicious or harmful cycles of violence and instability and into more beneficial cycles of peace. And we found that this happened largely as a result of interaction between the principles of health and gender equality and the mechanisms that were used to try and make those principles a reality. So the provision of health services, the movements towards gender equality, the importance of networks of advocates for gender equality, but also advocates for health equity. So it was a very kind of broad empirical effort to say, look, health matters, gender equality matters, and there is strong evidence to show that improved health and improved gender equality are very strongly associated, and there's a causal relationship between improvement in health and gender and more peaceful societies. I think one of the things that I'd like to kind of emphasize, and following from reflection on some of what Michael was talking about, where there's hope is within communities and with community activists and advocates. And we're seeing a discussion of people just being tired of violence and conflict. There was a really interesting article in the New York Times about a week or two ago where he talked about this growing sentiment in the Middle East of this fatigue with war and this desire for peace. And we've all seen the importance of local advocacy, but that needs space, right? And I think one of the challenges it is that we're living in this world of transactional diplomacy where might makes right, and where the United States is equating peace with a cessation of hostilities, kind of. Is Gaza, is that a ceasefire? Is it really a ceasefire? And there's no real commitment to realizing the kinds of rights that we've been talking about, and the importance of human dignity, the importance of security guarantees. And so I think that, while there's hope in this, and we emphasize this in the Lancet Commission report, while there's hope in these kind of local and transnational movements and push for health equity and for gender equality and the right to health, it needs a facilitating environment internationally, and it needs champions internationally, and we don't seem to have that anymore.
Could you talk about some of the highlights of that as you saw, sometimes unprecedented in Gaza?
Yeah, so I think, the right to health has always been precarious in times of conflict, and the Safeguarding Healthcare Coalition is documenting attacks on healthcare facilities and health workers, and has shown that these attacks have increased over time. And I think Gaza, in many ways, represents the most egregious example of that, but not the only one. And we've just witnessed in Sudan the attack in Al Fashir, and the devastating attack on a hospital, and the killing of people in the hospital. So this is not only a Gaza issue. It's part of a worldwide erosion of the recognition of the right to health. And one of the things that we're also seeing, and I'll get to the paper in a second, is that previously, if you think about it, the Russian attacks on hospitals in Syria, they at least referred to international law and basically saying that the neutrality had been eroded. There was some reference to it. And now it seems that there's not even an effort to refer to it, right? They don't even, parties to a conflict don't even feel the need to justify that somehow they're not in violation of these rights. So, in terms of the paper, I think one of the things that we're trying to do is show that the right to health is obviously critically important in contexts of conflict and violence, but that we haven't had a really good measure or assessment mechanism for how those rights are being violated. So we tend to focus on attacks on healthcare facilities, and attacks on healthcare personnel and on ambulances. But what we're trying to do in the paper is expand that a little bit and kind of embed the right to health within this broader understanding of international humanitarian law and the protections that international humanitarian law gives to kind of the social determinants of health, like food and water, et cetera. And the other point that I think it's important to make is that if this is a critical moment, an inflection point, I guess, in the kind of the right to health. If there isn't an effort to reify this norm after what we've seen in Gaza, what happens to it, right? And kind of what Michael was referring to, the world will be a much, much more dangerous place. But civilians that have, their only crime is being born in the wrong place, which is not a crime, right? They're just misfortune of being born in the wrong place. And that could be you, me, Meta, or Michael that are in those contexts. The protections are being eroded. And if we don't use this moment to kind of document this, the violations of the right to health, show how we can better assess whether the right to health is being protected, then I really fear that future conflicts are just going to see even more attacks on healthcare and on the very things that civilians need to be able to survive conflict.
Thank you, Val. Yeah, my interest with the paper was sometimes more the broader determinants of health and based on the Ottawa Charter. So not just healthcare facilities when you found 3/4 or more of facilities destroyed, initially with a justification of a command and control center being under a hospital. And then sometimes it was, well, Palestinian fighters had actually done it to themselves in the hospital. And then later that ended up going, the attacks on healthcare personnel, the ambulances, the physicians and nurses. The numbers are horrifying. But for me, it was also looking at housing, domicile, scholasticide with all of the educational facilities, the attacks on water and electricity, and later on food, which became much more enhanced.
The right to health is well anchored within international law. And indeed, I think those who were involved in the initial creation of these rights back in the 1940s, as the modern architects of international law, such as in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, they would say, without health, most other rights have little meaning. So the right to health is not only one of a number of rights recognized in international law. It's probably one of the cornerstone rights, simply because so many other rights rest on its shoulders. We find the right to health mentioned in a number of significant primary documents of international law, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and then a whole host of other conventions and treaties that were developed in the 1980s, the 1990s, and onward, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, Racial Discrimination Convention, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and a lot of regional conventions that were developed in Europe, in the Americas, and in Asia. And what the right to health actually says is that everybody, whether you're in Canada or you're in Cameroons, you're in Mozambique, or you're in Malaysia, everybody, because of the mere fact that you're a human being, you have the right to the progressive realization of the principle of enjoying the highest obtainable standard of physical and mental health within the domain of your particular country. That everybody should have equal rights and equal access to the right to health. That states and individuals and organizations must refrain from interfering with the right to health. That you're to ensure that these institutions fulfill the right to health, and this is true in all circumstances. There's no exception to this, even under an occupation. And what I looked at in my report around 2017 or 2018 on the right to health, I looked at this is before the genocide began in Gaza. I looked at the various means of interference by Israel, the occupying power, with respect to the right to health to the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. I found that hospitals were undersupplied. I found that there was interference with the running of hospitals. I found that this is particularly so in Gaza. Gaza had been subject to a pretty effective blockade by Israel since 2007, where Israel, even though it had withdrawn its settlers and withdrawn its troops from the soil of Gaza, was involved in determining who and what entered Gaza and who and what left and was able to leave Gaza, which meant that there were restrictions on the amount of drugs or medical equipment going in there. Often some of these drugs and some of these medical equipment going to the hospitals in Gaza during this period of time were forbidden by Israel because they had a so-called dual use possibility that could be used against Israel. This was this dual use approach was applied in an extremely broad fashion, such that healthcare always was going to be a challenge in the 30-some hospitals and the healthcare clinics in Gaza. It meant restrictions on healthcare units going into Gaza. It meant difficulty in trying to get Palestinians in Gaza to be able to be trained as nurses, as healthcare workers, as physicians, and as specialists with respect to this. It also meant that because there was limits on the quality of healthcare that could be obtained in Gaza, that many Palestinians needed to leave Gaza to go to better equipped Palestinian hospitals in East Jerusalem or in the West Bank. And they needed to get permission from the Israeli occupation authorities to be able to do that, and were unable to wind up getting the requisite permission to travel from Gaza to East Jerusalem and the West Bank to do so. So these and a range of other restrictions on the ability of Palestinians to be able to develop to the maximum extent possible within their resources, their capacity to deliver an effective healthcare system to the 4.5 to 5 million Palestinians living under occupation, always meant that there were going to be significant restrictions on the right to health. Then we reach October 2023 with the attack by Hamas and other armed groups on Israel, and then the extraordinary degree of revenge attack by Israel, which lasted more than 2 years, and as we know, killed at least 70,000 Palestinians in Gaza, around 83% of whom would have been unarmed civilians, men, women, and children, regards to this. Most of the hospitals in Gaza had to close. Some of them had been attacked by Israeli forces and have been either severely damaged or almost entirely destroyed. At least hundreds and hundreds of healthcare workers were killed during those 2 years in Gaza. Almost 600 aid workers, including more than 400 who worked for the United Nations, also were killed, almost all of them being Palestinian.
I just wanted to add to what Michael was saying about the current or what happened in Gaza since 2023. So not only did you have attacks on healthcare, but those attacks had a very particular pattern. So the Human Rights Office of the UN had done a report that showed that when Israeli military personnel went into a hospital, they followed the same playbook. So that indicated that was part of the military strategy to target healthcare facilities. The other thing that I'd like to just follow up from what Michael was talking about in terms of the restriction of supplies. So what we saw is, and you're still seeing it today, this restriction of humanitarian supplies into Gaza, and the inability for medical supplies to come in, and also the inability for many Gazans who required evacuation out of Gaza to receive care internationally, that slowed to a trickle. So there were so many ways in which the right to health was just completely disregarded and violated. related to health itself, but also things like the ability of individuals to be able to access healthcare institutions that were open, the challenges of negotiating safe passage to those healthcare settings when they needed assistance, and the ability of medical personnel to be able to provide quality of care given the restrictions of medical supplies, the lack of electricity, the lack of anesthetic, right? It's just, it is something that that is horrifying, right? There's no real other word for it. So I just wanted to provide that other element, and then also to just remind people that Israel has just recently blocked some key international non-governmental organizations, including Médecins Sans Frontières, from operating in Gaza. And MSF its neutrality has been well established. And so if they're not going to allow MSF, and they also suffered attacks on their facilities, that speaks volumes, I think.
Now that we have a ceasefire, so everything's all great in Gaza and the West Bank, isn't it, Michael? Or have you heard anything else?
This is an exceptionally tenuous ceasefire, which puts to shame almost the definition of ceasefire. It was reached by Donald Trump's fiat on around the 10th or 11th of October, almost 3 months ago. Since that time, we've had almost 500 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza by Israel. We've had what's estimated to be more than 1,000 violations by Israel with respect to the terms of the ceasefire agreement, which was subsequently ratified by the UN Security Council in November, and virtually no pushback. We're still in phase one of the so-called ceasefire process. Getting to ceasefire phase two, which is going to be the evacuation of the 58% of Gaza that Israel is presently occupying, and the disarming of Hamas, which I think will be a very tall order to wind up achieving, and the introduction of the so-called international stabilization force of various countries, largely Muslim majority countries, who are being asked to send troops to Gaza. Most of them are showing an extreme amount of reluctance to do that if the writ in which they're being tasked to perform is the disarmament of Hamas. So I fear that we're probably got an extremely shaky truce that's going on, that's not being honored. Israel alleges that the Palestinian armed groups are violating. That may be so, but certainly Israel is the one that has by far the superior weaponry and firepower, and it's showing that in the number of deaths that have occurred over the last 3 months. I'm skeptical as to whether we're going to be able to reach a situation where Gaza is entirely free of Israeli troops, where there's still some possibility of the Palestinian Authority and other Palestinian agencies coming in to be able to run Gaza, and that Gaza will be reconstructed. My sense is that what Israel's ultimate aim is the expulsion of almost all, or if not all, of the 2.2 million Palestinians living in Gaza, with the hope that they realize that Gaza is going to be unlivable for years, if not decades, to come, and that it's better just to wind up leaving. That, I think, is probably the aspiration of the present Israeli cabinet, and the ability of the United States to have the sustaining power to want to mobilize international capital to invest the $70 to $80 billion over the next 20 years it will take to rehabilitate Gaza, without the guarantee that Gaza can remain a non-conflict zone, such that these investments of these billions and billions of dollars won't be simply good money or bad money chasing after good. I don't see that in the present way in which the so-called ceasefire has been structured. And I see this, the situation of what's happened to the Palestinians living in Gaza over the last several months. We've had a terrifically fierce Mediterranean winter in Gaza, many days of huge downpours, with Palestinians living in inadequate tents on sandy soil, of communicable diseases spreading throughout Gaza, because there's no ability to be able to control sanitation, that the water all around these enormous tent communities are infested with fecal matter, with diseases, and that that Palestinians, including young babies, are dying of entirely preventable diseases like hypothermia. All of I think, is the world's attention has drifted elsewhere, and the extraordinary barriers that Israel is placing on the having food and medical supplies and other humanitarian equipment enter into Gaza at scale to what the need is has not been met. There was supposed to be a promise of 650 trucks a day. That has not been reached on any one time over the last 3 months with respect to that. And it's the Palestinians who wind up suffering and who must wind up wondering whether life will ever return to some kind of normalcy in the foreseeable future, such that it guarantees their desire to wind up staying.
So, but all's being quiet on the West Bank front. Is
Yes.
that right, Michael?
No, it's not. It's the West Bank again has been under the radar of the international media for the most part. There are enormous military operations, particularly in the north of the West Bank, in cities like Tulkarem, Nor Shams, which is an enormous refugee camp in the north, and also in both the city and the refugee camps in Jenin in the far north. We have more than 40,000 Palestinians from the Jenin area alone who've been forced to seek refuge elsewhere in the West Bank, probably again without having homes to return to, as their homes in the refugee camp and in the town of Jenin are being destroyed. Hundreds of Palestinians, it's probably closer to 1,100 Palestinians have died since October 2023 in operations in the West Bank. And the biggest single face, if you like, of the illegal Israeli occupation is the creation, sustaining, and expansion of the Israeli settlements. In 2025, Israel broke the record for the most housing units for its segregated Israeli settlements that in any year since it's occupied the West Bank. And recently, there's an area called the E1 area, which is east of Jerusalem, where Benjamin Netanyahu attended a ceremony to announce the creation of 2,400 housing units in this area. This will effectively sever the West Bank from north to south. It means the end, even in the minds of the true believers, of a two-state solution, of a meaningful two-state solution, of a Palestinian state at least in part of the West Bank. So in their speeches, both Benjamin Netanyahu and the finance minister, who was also the minister of settlements, Shmulich, both said that the creation of this new settlement east of Jerusalem means the end of a Palestinian state, that there's no state to recognize and there's no one to recognize, in the words of the finance minister, Benziel Shmulich. So I think we have to begin to think of alternative futures for Israel and Palestine, one that is based not on partition of two separate states, because that now virtually is impossible, but of whether or not there can be some kind of either one state or confederation of Palestinians and Israelis living together under equality and governed by the rule of law, where all have equal citizenship rights.
In terms of international law, that people would probably be interested, because during your tenure, there was a lot about apartheid and now about genocide, and with the ICJ and ICC decisions, I think people would like to hear a little bit about those things.
This is a long history. I don't think it's nearly as complex as some people wanted to make it out to be. It essentially is a history of an indigenous people, the Palestinians, who've been there roughly 1,400 years as a Arabic-speaking people in Palestine, living as a majority population. When the Balfour Declaration in 1917 was issued by the British Imperial Cabinet to the British Zionist movement, at the time, over 90% of the people living in Palestine in 1917 were Palestinian Arabs, both Christians and Muslims. And what essentially was a third party, Britain, which didn't yet rule Palestine, promising to European Jews the land of Palestine to the European Zionist movement as a place to wind up settling. And many of the advocates, many of the political advocates in Britain for the Balfour Declaration were themselves anti-Semites who were quite happy to see European and British Jews consider moving elsewhere out of Europe to go to Palestine. Fast forward to 1947, at the time when the United Nations wound up passing its resolution in November of 1947, advocating the division of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. At the time, the population of about 2 million people, probably about 2/3 of the population, around 1.2 to 1.3 million people living in Palestine, were Palestinian Arabs. They still were the dominant majority indigenous population at that time, and they were virtually all against partition. They wanted to have Palestine become an independent state. They were certainly willing to live with the European Jewish immigrants who had come to Palestine over the last 30 years, but as a independent Palestinian state. And they were opposed to the partition, not only because they opposed partition itself, but also because the partition plan devised by the United Nations, which at that time was a predominantly European led organization of colonial and ex-colonial countries, created a very unfair partition where the minority immigrant population, the 1/3 of the population that were predominantly European Jews, where we're going to receive 56% of the land, most of the main ports, most of the fertile area along the coast, and most of the harbors for the new country. A war resulted from that. 750,000 Palestinians were forced to leave and were not granted the right to return. And Israel expanded its borders from the 56% laid out in the UN partition plan to 78% by the time the war came to an end by the signing of armistice treaties in 1949. Fast forward to today, where we've got now a 58-year-old occupation that's been declared to be illegal by the ruling of the International Court of Justice in July of 2024, primarily because occupation, the laws of occupation do not give the occupying power the right to even possess in perpetuity even a square centimeter of the occupied land. Occupation is meant to be temporary, and it's meant to have the entire territory returned to the people living under occupation. Israel has never obeyed that, has never accepted that the Geneva Conventions and the wars and the laws on occupation ever applied to its conquest of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. And yesterday, we've now had a new report coming out from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations, based in Geneva, which has looked at the discriminatory way in which Israel has been ruling the occupied territory since 1948. And it's come to the conclusion that this is in violation of the prohibition of apartheid. That indeed is a conclusion I came to 4 years ago, my 12th and last report as Special Rapporteur, which I delivered to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva in March of 2022. I also concluded that Israel's pattern of rule over the occupied territories met the legal definition of apartheid. Apartheid is a crime under the 1973 Convention Against Apartheid. This is reiterated in the 1998 Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. And indeed, Canada has brought in the 1998 Rome Statute into its domestic legislation. So this is a crime not only under international law, but also under Canadian law as well. And we're having this mounting evidence by significant human rights groups such as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, by Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem and Yesh Din, by Palestinian human rights groups, by special rapporteurs such as myself and my successor, Francesca Albanese, and now the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, all concluding that Israel is practicing apartheid. And why do we say that? We don't say that as a slur, as an insult to be directed towards Israel. This is based on a careful assessment of the facts on the ground and tied to whether or not all of these facts taken together reasonably meet the definition of the crime of apartheid in international law. And not to go into great detail with respect to this, but the basis for my conclusion and the conclusion of all these other organizations was essentially what you look at are the over 400 now Israeli settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, the 750,000 Israeli settlers living on occupied territory in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. These are segregated Jewish-only settlements which enjoy a standard of living equivalent to Israeli Jews living in Israel itself behind its 1948 borders, which is equivalent to the standard of living that you'd find in some southern European countries, such as Spain or Portugal or Italy. They have full voting rights as Israeli citizens living in this occupied territory. They have full access to benefits being offered, such as health care in Israel, and they live under the rule of law of Israeli law, which treats Israeli Jews as being equal to one another. This is in stark contrast to the fate of Palestinians living in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, who live under military law or under a residual amount of diminished rights under law for the 350,000 Palestinians living in East Jerusalem. They don't have the right to vote for the country or the state that winds up dominating their daily lives. They don't have access to many of these benefits that Israeli citizens living in the settlements can. They cannot live in the settlements themselves, even if they wanted to. And their land is steadily being confiscated for more land for settlements, for more roads to connect the settlements to each other and to within Israel, and for more industrial parks that are being built within these lands to wind up creating goods and services which are imported into Israel or to the rest of the world. So all of this winds up saying that because Palestinians live under a two-tier legal system, a two-tier political system, a two-tier housing and property system, this amounts to apartheid, satisfies the definition under international law, and means that Israel is standing accused of one more extremely serious crime under our regime of international law, of apartheid, of systematic discrimination, and of genocide, and of conducting an illegal occupation for the past almost 6 decades.
Yeah, no, thank you, Michael. I know we aren't going to be able to get into the ICJ, just a preliminary finding of plausible genocide and justification of that. We're not going to be able to get into some of the rules of war things that I had hoped to get into more.
May I ask him a question? I can't bear to let Michael go without having him expand for at least a minute on the reference he made to his, I presume, preferred solution, which seems to be some kind of integrated one-state solution. I really would be very sorry if we didn't have at least one moment focusing on that. What would that look like, Michael? And what would it? What are the odds? How would you even go about trying to accomplish something like that?
Sure. What the obligations of international law say is that all countries that respect the human rights of their citizens and those who live under their rule, and that they should be governed by the rule of law. And that's not the case with respect to the Palestinians living in the occupied territory. And it's also the case of exceptional discriminatory laws treating Palestinian citizens of Israel as well. And what a number of human rights organizations have laid out is probably the only way in which a just solution can be resolved is is either a two-state solution or a one-state solution. And a two-state solution, that possibility seems to be disappearing with the living of 750,000 Israeli Jews in these segregated communities in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. So a one-state solution may take on various different forms. It could be a pure one-state solution of Palestinians and Israelis. And remember that there is an equal number of Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews living between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, which is the territory that Israel winds up controlling these days. So to forestall the continued application of apartheid, you'd want to have a one-state solution where everybody has the right to vote, everybody has equal rights under the law, political rights, social rights, and so on. There are others who advocate of living within a single political space, but perhaps under a more of a confederation aspect like we have here, where maybe there would be provinces or cantons where majority Palestinians would have the right to have, if you like, provincial or legislative powers over education, over religious regulation, over social benefits, and so on, while everybody has the same general range of rights under a unified system of, what would you call it, Israelstein? I don't know. But there are variations on a one-state solution, which seems to me probably the best thing to wind up pushing for, because I think you always rally more people when your primary platform is human rights than your primary platform is partition and the separation of them from us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Michael. And now, as we have to wrap up, and of course, we'll get to talk more about the right to health and other issues during our Pegasus conference and pre-conference events.
When Michael was speaking, I was reflecting on how challenging it is to navigate the Israeli-Palestinian issue without being charged with being anti-Semitic. And I think that that this gets at one of the broader challenges, is that we need to focus on kind of these overarching humanitarian principles, the concept of humanity, the things that binds us all together, rather than the kind of identity divisions that pull us apart. And I think, what Michael talked about throughout his discussion was a focus on these principles of rights, that regardless of your identity or your religion or your history, you have a responsibility to ensure that other people have those rights, and that the realization of your own rights needs to be respected. And I think that somehow we need to keep emphasizing that message in a context of polarization. For people like me, establish kind of the empirical evidence for what happens when those rights aren't protected, what happens to not only individual well-being and the opportunities, the life opportunities that are lost, but happens to communities and their safety and security and their well-being, and countries and regions. And so we know that our North Star needs to be that kind of that perception of humanity, a commitment to rights, and how I think we all owe it to each other and to future generations to use this moment as a way to double down on that.
There's certainly no bright moment on the horizon, but we have to maybe we'll look beyond the horizon for Valerie's North Star. That's the solution. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.